Just bear with me while I start the recording. We do have permission from Kathryn for that. No one has their cameras on, so I'm assuming you're all okay with that. This is probably the last event we'll have for SAE Manitoba for this season, and we'll take a summer break, and then we're going to try to arrange some things for September, October. Right now we're assuming we will have to do those virtually still. So we're going to plan on doing some more virtual events. And then fingers crossed, we might be able to do some in-person events before the end of the year or maybe early 2022. Oh yes, if you have any questions for Kathryn, you can put them in the chat. We did find that if you put the chat to everyone, then it kind of bogged up people's screens. So if you could kindly do your chat privately to me, Irene Vasilevsky, and I'll ask your question on your behalf. If you prefer to do it in person, certainly take yourselves off mute and do it in person, because you may have a question that would warrant a discussion with Kathryn. So today I'll introduce our speaker, Kathryn Adamanchuk. I printed this in the smallest font. I don't know why. So Kathryn has a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Manitoba. She worked for many years at Standard Aero as a service engineer, traveled around the world inspecting gas turbine engines. And while she was there, she completed her MBA. And then for the last 8 years, Kathryn has been, and this is the longest title ever, Kathryn, Aero Engine Test and Advanced Digital Manufacturing Engineer in Residence and Industry Partnerships Facilitator for the Price Faculty of Engineering. Is that like literally what's on your card?
Well, the good thing is that I got a couple extra things added to it since we've been online, so I don't have any business cards yet, so I don't even know how it's going to fit.
Oh my goodness, that is like literally the longest one. And she develops industry-related courses, provides mentorship to students, and acts as a facilitator to strengthen relationships between U of M and industry. She's very passionate about women in engineering. Her and I volunteered together for, I keep wanting to call it APEGM, but EGM, on a committee for that. She's a founder and coordinator of Women in Engineering and Geoscience mentorship program that aims to create a community of women in engineering and geoscience from undergrads, and matches undergrad students with professionals. And in 2020, Kathryn completed her yet another degree, a Master's of Science in Biosystems Engineering, where she did this thesis topic that she's going to present today. So thanks, Kathryn, if you could do your presentation.
Absolutely, thank you, Irene. And hello, everyone. I recognize a few names, so it's nice to see some familiar names if I can't see your faces. Feel free to ask questions as we go. There's no need to wait until the end of the presentation if you have any questions or anything like that. We'll keep it pretty informal. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about the thesis work that I did, which was actually done in conjunction with Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba. They were a sponsor of this and provided a lot of the background information, which was really important to understand what was going on with women in engineering. And so what we were looking at in this study was understanding career persistence of women. And that's a really broad topic. And we wanted to focus it in on women in the engineering workforce, just in Manitoba. And then even to kind of bring the scope in even a little bit narrower, we were only going to look at former members and graduates never registered. So members, whether they were interns or professional engineers that left the profession, and then graduates from an engineering program that actually never registered with Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba. So we're just going to go through kind of an introduction and some background. I'll talk about the research question that was posed, the literature review that I did, the methodology we followed for this study, and then the findings and the discussion, a summary, and then we can just have a sort of group discussion at the end as well. So as a bit of an introduction, this is probably not unknown to this group, as you're probably all engineers or familiar with engineering, but men outnumber women in engineering in Manitoba nearly 10 to 1. And that's probably about the same across the country. And that's a problem. And we know it's a problem because engineering is a profession that's supposed to support the public. And it's really hard to put the best interests of the public in all of our decision making if we don't have a profession that adequately represents the public. So it's a problem, and it's something that has been looked at for many, many years. So you can see in this slide here, this chart, this is the 20-year trend of female engineering student enrollment at the University of Manitoba, as compared to law and medicine and science, which you can see even back in 1999 was quite a bit higher, almost parity. And engineering has always lagged behind. So back in 1999, actually the year I graduated, we had about 21% female enrollment in the Faculty of Engineering. And that was actually one of the highest numbers that we've had since then. So basically 1999, we saw a dip here, and then we've seen it rise back up to, the latest data we have is 2018 right now. And this year it's about 23% enrollment in female enrollment in engineering programs. The reason why we had this high number here, and if we backed it up another 10 years, you'd see that there was actually kind of a sharper increase. And that actually stemmed there's a lot of evidence that supports that increase up to this 1999 number was as a result of some campaigns that were put on after the École Polytechnique massacre that happened in 1989, where a number of female engineering students lost their lives. And so after that, there was kind of a push by the engineering community to encourage more women to consider STEM professions. And that kind of drove the numbers up. And then as advertising campaigns kind of do, they sort of see the numbers increase and back off a little bit. And then we start to see the numbers decrease. And then again, a push over the last few years to try to increase that. So there have been efforts underway for decades, a lot of grassroots efforts, but we really haven't achieved that much over the last 20 years in terms of increasing the number of females enrolling in engineering programs. So recruitment, though, is only one issue, right? Getting more females into the engineering program is only one part of the pipeline. We also have to make sure that we're retaining the women once they've chosen, those 23% that we have that have chosen engineering. We want to make sure that they are, happy in that profession, and we can retain them throughout their professional career. So many efforts have kind of focused on recruiting young women into engineering, but understanding why women leave is actually not that well understood. So what we want to do is understand the pipeline of women as they move through sort of these various stages in their engineering career. So when we look at this kind of leaky pipeline, this is it's kind of commonly used terminology to kind of look at how women kind of filter out of the engineering profession. We can make a couple assumptions in this, and this is actually based on Manitoba statistics from 2019. It is just a snapshot in time. It's just the numbers that are coming from the data in 2019. The number of women at each stage in this pipeline varies, so we just showed it as percentages. But we can assume that about 50% of secondary school students are female, so high school students, about half of them are female. We can't actually get that data very easily. The school system has pretty tight privacy regulations about releasing gender data of students because they're underage. But we can make a pretty good assumption. It's about 50%. And obviously then we see that we lose a lot of women because we only have, at 2019, we only had about 21% of our engineering students being women. So obviously we have a big leak there, and that's where a lot of this recruitment effort is focused, is in the secondary school system, trying to get women interested in engineering, early on, even elementary school, and things like that. But what is the good news in this pipeline is that we're actually seeing a pretty good retention, actually a higher retention than male counterparts of women that have chosen to go into engineering. So actually 22% of our engineering graduates in 2019 were female. So we actually lost more male students than we did female. So we actually had really good retention of our female engineering students. So that's an indication that we're doing kind of the right things in our engineering program to retain the women in kind of their undergraduate degree. What we see though is we're losing some women after they graduate. We can see in that same year, even though we had 22% of engineering graduates that are female, we only had about 19% turn into interns, basically register as interns with Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba. So there's some that are graduating with engineering degrees, but not actually pursuing professional licensure. And then we lose even more. We're seeing a drop off between the interns and actually the women that proceed through and become professional engineers. And then when you look at it, this is a really long pipeline. Overall, about 11% of professional engineers in 2019 in the province of Manitoba are women, but we know that there's some attrition there. So trying to increase this number, if we're adding 17% of our new PEngs a year, it takes a really long time to increase this 11%. 5 years ago, we were at 10%, and now we're at 11%. But we know anecdotally that there is women that are dropping out at various points in their career after they've obtained their professional designation. And the association prior to the study hadn't actually been tracking that attrition. If you don't renew your membership, you get put on sort of this withdrawal or this written off status, but they never actually followed up to find out what the numbers of women versus men were and things like that. So we can see that there's kind of a loss at various stages in this pipeline. So retention issues exist several places, and what we're going to focus on in this study is the losses that we're seeing between graduation and registration as an intern, and then the losses that we're seeing at the various points once they've registered. So they were members of the association, and then they've kind of dropped off at some point in their career. So the research question that was posed was, what are the elements of women's experiences in the engineering profession that both enable and deter their persistence in the profession, and how do these elements or factors interact with one another over time and space? So we're looking at kind of the factors of persistence. And that's a really broad research question. So when we kind of looked at how we were going to form the study, we brought it down a lot. This is only a small fraction of the knowledge gain that's needed to really fully understand career persistence. We're only looking at some former members and some graduates that never registered in Manitoba. So it's a really small pool of people, but it still gives us more information that can move us forward on kind of understanding this bigger career persistence issue. So a little bit about the literature review. In kind of preparing for the study, we wanted to kind of understand what was going on in different regions around the world. So we obviously looked at, kind of globally, but we looked at Canada and kind of what was happening with other research studies regarding women in engineering in the workforce and retention. We looked at similar studies maybe conducted in the United States, also Australia and the United Kingdom, because they have somewhat similar regulatory frameworks around kind of engineering as a profession. So the review kind of included this sort of explanation or understanding of the regulatory framework regarding kind of professional engineering. It also looked at academic research, so studies that were done through universities, and then advocacy-based research, so studies that would have been done by groups like Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba or other women in engineering kind of focus groups. What the research kind of revealed, and it's presented as sort of this conceptual framework. This is sort of a synthesis of all of the research that it was explored. And kind of how I've presented it is sort of a balance between retention and attrition. And that's kind of what leads to career persistence of women in engineering. So on the retention side of the scale, a lot of the research was focused on, retaining women is tied to making sure that there's a sense of community and belonging in the profession, in the workplace, that there's a sense of career fulfillment in the career that they've chosen, and that there's opportunities for advancement, that there's actually technical affirmation. So that somebody actually says, hey, you're a good engineer. That goes a long way in actually encouraging women to remain in the profession. And then obviously some more things that are kind of pretty obvious: respectful and supportive workplaces, and then the consistent application of EDI policies. And the consistent application is what's really important here. It's not good enough to just have equity, diversity, and inclusion policies in your organization. It's making sure that those policies are consistently applied. So maternity leave is one thing, but parental leave is a more broad-based policy, equity, diversity, and inclusion policy. But it still needs to be applied consistently. So if it's only women that are using maternity or parental leaves, and there has not been any men in the company that have taken advantage of that policy, then it still becomes sort of like, well, it's a women's issue. They're the ones raising the children. And so even though the policies are there, it's actually making sure that they're being applied by everyone in the organization. And that kind of ties back to that sense of community and belonging. And then the literature on the attrition side, so the reasons why women are leaving the profession, based on previous literature, is a lack of opportunity for advancement. So there just isn't the positions to move up in the company. A lack of continued interest in engineering. So just finding out that it's not the profession that they're interested in. There is some evidence of some women and men as well using engineering as a stepping stone to other professions, intention to pursue another profession. And we know lots of engineers that have gone on to business, some have gone on to medicine and law. So engineering it's a great base profession that opens a lot of doors. So there is going to be some attrition of both genders moving on to kind of other professions. But then there are some more factors that tie kind of a little bit more specifically from a gender perspective. Dislike of the engineering culture. So there's some evidence that there's still sort of this bro culture that exists in engineering. And then job inflexibility. And this is one that's has been cited a lot, that engineering isn't necessarily a profession where there are options for part-time work or job sharing or flexible hours. And that can kind of lead women away from the profession as well. So this was kind of a synthesis of all the research from those kind of 4 global regions that I looked at. And then kind of overarching all of this is the view of licensure. So there's also this idea that you can still work in engineering without being licensed as a professional engineer. There's many people that are graduated engineers that don't have their professional designation. So how does this licensure play into either retention or attrition of women in engineering? And how easy is it to get your license and maintain your license? And what is the view of licensure and the benefits of belonging to the association? So that was kind of an overarching lens to look at as well. So there was some gaps in the literature that kind of led to how we were going to form this study. There was limited academic studies on the retention of women in the engineering workforce. Lots of studies about, women entering the engineering profession. So from that transition from high school into engineering programs, and a lot of research related to retention of women during their engineering education, but not a lot focused on workplace retention, because that's kind of outside of that academic realm. For the most part, it's harder to get those participants in a study, as I found out. A lot of the research was also quantitative in nature, very survey-based, which doesn't give you maybe a richer understanding of what's really going on. It's just answering questions that have been predetermined. And so it's kind of really hard to understand individual stories. There was also a lack of research on career persistence through that lens of professional licensure and regulation and how that kind of tied to things, because that really hasn't been explored. Canada has probably one of the most sort of high uptake on licensure in engineering, but then also kind of the regulation about the use of the title and things like that is a little bit more strict than a lot of other jurisdictions. So what we needed is a more qualitative approach that allowed women to tell their stories. And we wanted to focus on from a Manitoba perspective, because this was being sponsored by Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba. So we just wanted to look at the women in our own province and why did they leave the profession, or why did they graduate from the program but not actually pursue licensure. So the methodology then that we undertook for the study was what we call a phenomenological qualitative research approach, which basically just means gathering individual perspectives from a small group of participants and sitting down with them and trying to correlate their stories into themes around a particular experience. So their experience in the workforce in engineering in Manitoba. And then for the graduates that hadn't actually transitioned into engineering roles, kind of why not, and understanding that kind of experience. So the data was gathered using one-on-one interviews. We used open-ended questions, and I bookended the individual interviews with sort of focus group sessions. The data was all kind of coded manually, so I had pages and pages and pages of transcripts, and reading through each transcript and pulling out keywords, and then using software to help with that, to develop sort of themes surrounding all of this. And obviously, because we were dealing with people and this was being done at an academic institution, we had to get research ethics board approval. So that was kind of a big deal. So it is, making sure that we're not compromising the data, and we're not violating privacy laws, and that we're protecting the safety and security of our participants. So the participants themselves, we looked at 2 groups of women. So former practicing members, these were women who are registered with Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, either as an intern or as a professional engineer, but let their membership lapse between the range of January 2013 and June 2018. So we looked at that kind of 5.5-year time frame, and we're going to look at women that kind of let their membership lapse. And then the second group of women was at other point in the pipeline, where it was women who graduated with an engineering degree from the University of Manitoba, whether that was bachelor's, master's, PhD, any discipline that is offered at the U of M, during the range of 2013 to 2016, but hadn't been registered with any Canadian engineering regulatory body. So they were not an intern anywhere in Canada, which was also, a lot of data gathering and trying to determine where these women had gone and were they registered in a different jurisdiction. So the findings, and this was kind of what's really interesting, is some of the numbers that we're seeing in the province. So if we look at the former practicing members for that 5.5-year period, there was 195 women who let their practicing membership lapse. So that accounts for about 18.5% of all the female members in Manitoba. 75% of that 195 were professional engineers when they let their membership lapse. And 40% of those worked in the engineering consulting sector in their last role. So there's some evidence there that we want to dig into further. We didn't, for the purposes of the study, we were just kind of focusing on understanding the stories, but there's some interesting points here that's kind of worth some exploration in terms of the numbers in certain sectors of engineering that we found were leaving the profession. The 53 accounts for the women that were actually invited to participate based on last known residence, being Manitoba, and their age, being less than 55. So this 195 seems very scary. And when I saw that number, I was like, whoa, they're dropping like flies. But when we actually started sorting through the data, and all this data was provided by Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, the number wasn't as bad, because a lot of these 195, a significant portion of them anyways, were registered in multiple jurisdictions. As is common when you're working in consulting, you get if you're doing a project in Manitoba, you'll get a license in Manitoba for that year, but maybe the project's over, you don't need that license, or there's just migration across the country. And then actually a good portion of the 195, a significant portion, 10% or more, were actually over 55. So if they were leaving the profession, it was probably because they were, considering retirement. It wasn't necessarily because they were being driven out of the profession. So we kind of made that age range less than 55 as the pool of women who we wanted to invite to participate. So of the 53 that we invited to participate in the study, 5 women actually agreed to participate. So it's really hard to not only get the information about these women, track them down, invite them, but then actually convince them to participate, because people are busy. And they may not understand kind of why we need this information because they've left the profession, right? So, they may not see the reasoning why we want to talk to them because they're not in it anymore. So we had 5 women that signed letters of informed consent to participate. 3 of them were professional engineers when they let their membership lapse, and 2 of them were interns. In our graduates never registered group during that sort of 4-year period from 2013 to 2016, we had 269 women who graduated from the Price Faculty of Engineering. 224 of those we were authorized to contact through advancement services, which is basically the alumni group. You can't just automatically go contact your former students. You have to kind of go through the alumni group, and some people don't want to be contacted, so that kind of filtered down a little bit. We ended up reaching out to 184 women who listed Manitoba as their last known address, which can be problematic because sometimes when people graduate, they don't want the alumni department to know that they've moved. They just leave their parents' address, or they change their address, something. So we don't necessarily know that these 184 women are at these actual addresses, because these addresses are their last known address when they were graduated, unless they've updated it. But of those 184, during that period, 44% of those 184 were registered as interns. 17.4% were professional engineers by that point. So that's a good number that had actually gone through the process of getting their professional designation. But what is really surprising was that 71 of those 184 had not registered at any jurisdiction. So almost 40% of this pool of graduates had not registered with any provincial regulatory body. Of those 184, again, it was really hard to track down these women and convince them to participate in the study. So we had 4 that agreed to participate. So those were all graduates of the engineering program, but did not pursue any kind of licensure. So when we met with those women in those interviews and those focus groups, and the focus groups, we kind of divided everything into the former members group and the graduates never registered group. But when we started bringing the themes together, we kind of combined both groups of women. And we started to see themes arising from these interviews and these stories that we were hearing from the women about what their experience was with career persistence in engineering in Manitoba. And so we looked at some of the themes, and the way the data kind of rolled out was that there was some aspects related to the profession. So in some of our interviews, all of our interviews, we asked the question, what is engineering? And surprisingly, all of these women had been through an engineering program. Some of them had masters and PhDs, and almost everyone struggled with coming up with a concise, clear definition of engineering, because it's so many things. And so that was kind of a theme was, hey, you know what, we've got this profession, but it's a little bit confusing in trying to describe what it is, because it can be so many different things. We also explored reasons for choosing engineering, their reasons for leaving if they were part of that former members group, or their reasons for not pursuing engineering work after they graduated, for our graduates never registered group. We looked at and explored what they thought the role of the association was, Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, and we asked them about their views on licensure. So how did they feel about, licensure? Was it something that they wanted to pursue, that they were encouraged to pursue from their employers, and things like that? The next theme was around belonging. And so we had questions posed for our interviews related to their experiences with diversity that they saw in the workplaces that they'd been in, or in the classrooms that they were in the Price Faculty of Engineering. We also looked at that treatment in the workplace, in the classroom. And then we talked about technical and personal fit. So how did they feel that they felt? How did they feel about their technical fit? Did they feel like they had the right technical skills for the role that they were given, or that they'd applied for? And then personal fit, how did they feel about them fitting in with that organization and feeling comfortable with that organization and their colleagues? The third theme was about culture. And so that looked at a little bit more beyond just diversity and treatment, but looking at the culture of the workplace, which kind of ties a little bit to the policies and procedures in those organizations and within the engineering faculty. And then looked at work-life balance and policies and procedures, and just kind of anecdotally, what are their experiences with work-life balance? And then the fourth theme was about the future. So we asked all participants whether or not they had left the profession or hadn't even considered licensure after graduation. What would be their criteria for reentry into the profession, or even just taking up the process of becoming licensed? And then what would be the barriers to reentry? So what would be preventing them from coming back to the profession? And we wanted to explore those topics. So that was kind of the themes that kind of came from all of the interviews and focus group sessions that we held. So to talk about each one of those in a little bit more detail, this sort of perceptions of the profession, what the women are actually telling us, and what we kind of gleaned from these interviews, there really is a lack of a clear definition of engineering. Because it can be so many things. And that can be daunting, especially for new graduates, because they're not sure that the work that they're doing actually constitutes engineering. And if they don't have the confidence, they may not actually think, well, what I'm doing is engineering, so I should become an intern. They may think, well, this doesn't sound like what I think engineering should be. I'm not doing any stress calculations, so I must not be doing engineering. Therefore, I'm not going to become an intern, because they'll never approve my work experience. So that kind of lack of definition, a clear definition, kind of tied to confidence in registration in our new graduates. The reasons for pursuing engineering, a lot of the women said, well, they had an aptitude for math and science. And we've heard that from many engineers. That's why they go into engineering. They like math and science and hands-on and things like that. But it was also because there was a wide variety of job opportunities. Several participants said, because there's lots of things I can do with an engineering degree, which is really good that they had that insight, that they knew that engineering would lead to many different job opportunities. The reasons for discontinuing practice or not pursuing licensure were really multidimensional. Every woman had their own story. Things like some health implications, a lot of work-life balance and balancing work and family. And then the concern that the work they're doing doesn't actually qualify as engineering. So how can I become licensed when I'm working in this job, but I don't really think that it's engineering? And that kind of ties back to that, what is engineering? So that kind of lays out the perceptions of the profession. Overall, there was agreement from all participants that there was value in obtaining professional licensure, but the value of that PEng designation is seen as kind of more implicit than explicit in a lot of organizations that don't require work to be sealed. So a lot of we had participants from different disciplines. The ones that worked in consulting saw explicit value in the PEng designation. They had to have it to be able to move up in the workforce. But some of our other participants in the manufacturing, mechanical, electrical sectors found that it was more implicit. It's just something they wanted to do so that they could call themselves engineers, but it wasn't necessarily a requirement for employment. So there's that dichotomy that we see in that sort of explicit value of the PEng designation, and it's kind of organization and somewhat discipline specific as well. In terms of belonging, so diversity in the workplace was seen as a positive attribute by all participants. All of them welcomed diversity in the workplace, whether that was gender diversity, cultural diversity, but that was seen as a positive thing. They liked working for companies where there was diversity. But their experiences regarding belonging varied substantially. We had some participants that had some great experiences at certain positions they were in where they felt like they really belonged on the team. And we had other participants that had some really bad experiences where they just never felt, they felt nervous coming to work every day and it just wasn't a good fit and they didn't have that sense of belonging in the organization. The former practicing members, so the ones that had more experience working in the engineering profession, cited the importance of the personal and the cultural fit. They were really concerned with finding an organization where they fit in personally and they felt that that was the right culture to suit their working style. The graduates never registered though. When we asked them about fit, how do you know that you fit into a company? They all talked about technical fit and tied it to belonging because they were new graduates. So they hadn't really maybe seen that idea of fitting in culturally. They were just worried about making sure that they could do the calculations that they were asked to do, or that they wouldn't look dumb by not knowing a technical answer to something. So they were really concerned about making sure that they found a position where they felt that they had enough technical knowledge to fit in. And that probably comes with just experience in the workplace. In terms of culture, the cultural experiences of the women varied by the organizations. And we had some women that had worked at multiple organizations. But the trend that we saw is that larger organizations appear to have more rigorous policies and procedures that support work-life balance. And I mean, that makes sense because these larger organizations have more capacity and to implement these policies. So that tended to be what we're starting to see. And that's something that actually the 30 by 30 coalition is looking at, is some of these policies and procedures and trying to take best practices and implement them at organizations across the province. The bro culture, so this idea of sort of macho engineering still exists in many organizations as cited by the participants. And it can be little things. It can be little things like, there's a hockey team, but there's no other women. So it's really awkward to become the first woman on the company hockey team. And then you come back to work the next day and there's all these discussions that have happened in the locker room after hockey about work and you weren't part of it, right? So there's still that kind of bro culture, lots of events and team building that are very male oriented that may not appeal as much to female participants, but maybe not even just female participants, but bowling and pool and those types of team building events and things like that kind of exhibit some of that bro culture that still exists in many organizations. But our graduates never registered since they were kind of closer to being in the classroom, we asked them about their experiences, and they said that the classrooms appear to be more culturally sensitive and supportive. So when we asked that of the former members, they had some stories of kind of some bad experiences in the engineering classrooms, but our more recent graduates felt that there was really good cultural sensitivity and support in the engineering faculty, which is great to hear. But the new graduates did feel that the faculty culture is still more focused on academic rigor than actually preparing them for the workforce. So there's a big concern there about this transition from being a student to working, because when you're a student, everything is in 13-week chunks. And there's sort of this increase in workload up to the week 12, 13, and then you have an exam, and then you breathe, and then you start over again. And you know that everything's 13 weeks. If you can just get through 13 weeks, you're okay. And then they get to the workforce and there's no end, right? There's project after project after project, and it's, some of them can be very long. And so there was a transition there where they felt like they just didn't have that preparation for kind of what the norms of the workforce are in terms of how kind of work flows and things like that. So that was kind of an interesting observation. In terms of the future, 4 of the 5 former practicing members indicated that they would consider returning to the engineering workforce and re-pursuing their engineering licensure in the future, which was great. And actually one of them has actually returned and is now back to being a practicing member in the last year. When we asked them about their criteria for re-entry, the things that they would consider before coming back to the profession would be opportunities for part-time employment to better support work-life balance, support with relicensing and understanding that process. Several of our former practicing members had been out of the profession for more than 5 years. So it was a bit of a daunting task. Networks have shrunk, even just how to write a resume now, because things change over time, keywords that HR reps are looking for. So support with kind of that relicensing, but also even just the job search and networking portion of things. And then a desire for a good job fit. So just finding the right company that fits with what they're looking for in their job. Unfortunately, when we asked them about the barriers that would be preventing them from coming back, they align with their criteria, meaning that there are really no part-time employment opportunities generally in engineering. The support with relicensing was a little bit confusing at the time, and actually since then the association has released a return to practice guide that very clearly lays out within time chunks, less than 2 years, 2 to 8 years, 8 years plus, the process for returning to licensure. So that was kind of a benefit that arose from this information as the association took that on and put that guide together. But then the other barrier is that desire for a good fit. And that ties to this kind of shrinking network and not necessarily knowing which companies they should be applying for because they've been away from the profession. So that kind of was a tricky thing. Participants in both groups also expressed a lack of confidence as a significant barrier. And that lack of confidence is, how do I explain this resume gap? Or I graduated 2 years ago, how am I supposed to find a job now? Because every year there's new engineering graduates. How am I going to compete with the new graduates when I have 2 years where I wasn't working in engineering? Or just, how do I write my EIT report? I don't know if what I'm doing is actually engineering. So how do I make sure that I can actually become an intern? So a lack of confidence was actually expressed by both groups as kind of a barrier as to why they weren't either pursuing their licensure or why they weren't coming back to the profession. So a little bit of a discussion when we look at that conceptual framework that we talked about up front, where I kind of looked at all the literature review. If we look at the attrition side, because we were looking at women that had either left the profession or didn't pursue the profession after graduation, we can kind of see how the previous literature aligns with this study group. So in terms of this lack of opportunity for advancement, there was concern about a lack of opportunities to return to the workforce. So not a lack of opportunities for engineers, but a lack of opportunities for how do you get back in the workforce, and how do I, if I've taken 5 years off, how do I get back and actually make sure that I'm going to be in a position where I'm not 5 years behind, right? That if I had 15 years of experience and I've been away for 5 years, that I'm not starting back at day one with new interns, right? So the lack of opportunities to how do you get your foot back in the door? was expressed by our former members. The lack of continued interest in engineering, we actually had one participant who has no intention of ever becoming, working in engineering, got through the degree, did a co-op term, hated it, finished the degree, does not want to be an engineer, and is very happily doing something completely different right now. So that, that happens, right? But all graduates never registered indicated concerns with technical fit. So all those new grads were concerned about, I don't know if I'm going to fit in technically. I don't know if I have enough, experience to do the work that my colleagues are doing. So again, it kind of is a little bit tied to confidence as well, but it's really about that technical fit. Intention to pursue another profession, it really wasn't indicated by participants. Nobody did engineering of our participant group with the intention of doing something different after. One realized that it wasn't for her after the fact. But there is evidence in that data set. So those 269 graduates from that 2013 to 2016 period, there was 3 or 4 that had gone on to medical degrees and a couple other ones that had gone on to other postgraduate degrees in other disciplines beyond engineering. So there is some evidence that that is something that happens, and that's to be expected for men and women. Engineering, again, can be a good stepping stone into medicine or law or other programs as well. The dislike of the engineering culture, nearly all participants spoke of experiences with a bro culture and these microaggressions faced in the workplace. So microaggressions can be these little things, right? These death by, 1,000 cuts, or you're weighed down by a ton of feathers. These little things that can be completely unintended by the person saying them, but it's these sort of unconscious biases that can be perceived as sort of aggressions to the receiver. So, hey, Kathryn, you can take the meeting notes, or hey, we need to do team building. Kathryn, you plan the team building. These little things that indicate that women should be the ones doing the secretary work or the party planning, or those little things like, you don't necessarily fit in with us. Like, we're doing hockey, but you don't want to play hockey, do you? Right? Those little things that aren't really intended as being, derogatory, but they end up being perceived that way. And there is an underlying bias associated with some of those as well. And then that factor of job inflexibility, that was a key factor as to why several of our participants decided to leave the profession. So especially the former members, they just couldn't find a way to find a good balance between their engineering career and their home life that they wanted. So they left the profession, and they perceive that as being a barrier to the return, because there really isn't a lot of opportunities to pursue sort of this part-time work or job sharing opportunities or flexible hours. And a lot has changed. This study was completed in 2019, December of 2019. So a lot has changed in the last year, and we're starting to see that maybe there is opportunities for part-time work and working from home and more flexible hours. So there might be some bright spots that COVID has brought us in terms of how our profession can maybe adapt to some of these inflexibilities that we've seen in the past. So some additional implications regarding persistence. So there was pretty good alignment with what our study said compared to what the previous literature had said. The one that kind of stood out that really hadn't been kind of voiced in a lot of the other literature was this lack of confidence. And almost every woman in our study was, I don't feel confident either returning to the profession or pursuing licensure. So if we look at the former practicing members, that lack of confidence kind of manifested itself as how do I deal with resume gaps? How do I get back into the workforce? My network has shrunk. I don't know who the right people are anymore. How do I get my foot back in the door? Because HR is just going to filter me out because they're going to see this big resume gap. And so to address that, there's a lot of talk that's been going on over the last few years about returnship programs. And so these are programs that are designed kind of like an internship, where it's a period of time. It can be something like 4 to 6 months, where you are working as basically an intern, but at a senior level. You're returning to the workforce. It's a trial period for both you and the employer. It might include some upskilling. It may include some opportunities to potentially remain on afterwards, but no commitment to do that. So that could give women the opportunity and even men to explore the option of returning, but making sure it's the right fit before actually having to commit to something. So this is actually something that the association is starting to pursue. So we actually had a meeting last week about returnship programs and what that could look like. And so we're going to be probably holding some focus groups over the coming months about the opportunity to put something like this together. Obviously, this would have to be something that would be done in conjunction with industry, because you have to have those industry opportunities to be able to support this returnship program. But it's something that could help bridge that gap that we're seeing as a major barrier for former practicing members to come back into the profession. In terms of graduates never registered, their lack of confidence was about the intern program, about filling out all these reports and studying for the NPPE, and their perception of engineering work. Is what I'm doing engineering? Because it doesn't seem like what I was doing in stress. And if you look at the definition of engineering, it's very thorough. It's very encompassing. It covers a lot of different things, but it's not necessarily what people think when they think engineering. They think calculations and stress and calculus and things like that. So building confidence in understanding what you're doing and how that ties to the profession of engineering. And so the idea here is to institute something like an intern cohort program, where you would offer new graduates an opportunity to come to the association or virtually meet, maybe monthly, and have time to actually work on your EIT reports. Give yourself time and space to do that, because that's something that a lot of people struggle with. So kind of committing to this program and then using that cohort program to help you move through your EIT program. And study for the national practice exam, make sure that you're getting some information about what is engineering, what isn't, how to write your reports, and just building that confidence. So that's also something that the association is looking into as a result of this study and the ideas. And a lot of these ideas were expressed by the participants in the study. They were saying, well, can't we have some type of intern? They were talking about the movie where I can't remember the actor now, but he came back as an intern at Google, right? Was it Robert De Niro? He came back as an intern at Google or something like that when he was like a grandpa. So they were saying, something like that where we can just get in, obviously get paid, but get in and find our way back to the profession. So a lot of these ideas were actually expressed by the participants, which is great, and they're being followed up on. So as I said, this study was just a little sliver of all the stuff that we need to understand about career persistence of women in engineering. It would be great if we did a quantitative study as well. So actually sort of a survey based that would give us a larger population so we could more easily generalize the findings. I mean, we had 5 in one group and 4 in another group. We didn't have a lot of participants. So you can't take these findings and say, this is what it is, because the population is so small. And that's not the purpose of a qualitative study. But to kind of move things forward, you want to do a quantitative study where you do survey, all the women in the province and, get some generalizability of the findings. Obviously, women is only one side of things. We have to also understand career persistence of men in engineering to understand if the issues are similar or gender specific. If they're similar, then that kind of doubles the effort that industry should be putting into trying to retain their engineers. So there's an understanding that has to happen on that side as well. There needs to be additional or expanded research regarding the barriers and the criteria for re-entry. So just really understanding what are those barriers and what do different companies do to support kind of re-entry if they've had employees that have left for extended periods, and how could that potentially work? And then just also examining the equity, diversity, and inclusion policies at organizations of various sizes to understand differences in best practices. And this is actually something that the Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba 30 by 30 Coalition is looking at. So the 30 by 30 Coalition is actually, I think it's up to about 16 companies now. Some of the biggest engineering companies in the province are part of this coalition, and they meet at least every couple months, and they're driving some of these issues forward together as an industry organization. And they're looking at all these different policies that these companies have and trying to bring together the best practices and share them amongst themselves, which is really great to see. So we're getting some good engagement from industry in this as well. And then there needs to be some more investigation into sort of more accurate methods for determining the graduation to licensure rate at both the provincial and national level for both men and women. That graduation to licensure rate is actually I thought pretty low. It's in the 40s, high 40s of the number of people that graduate from an engineering program that transition over to professional licensure in Canada. And so it's really kind of hard to track that because you often lose track of graduates because they go into this black hole. They're not a student anymore, so you don't have an email. And unless they register with the Alumni Association and share their new contact info, they're not registered with an association. They just fall into this abyss, and you're trying to track down each individual person. So it's really hard to actually kind of determine this graduation to licensure rate accurately, especially because there's so many jurisdictions across Canada. So that's something actually that Engineers Canada is looking into, how they can better track those metrics. So to kind of summarize what I've talked about tonight, we did a phenomenological qualitative study looking at the former practicing members and then graduates that had never registered in Manitoba. The career persistence in engineering issue is a multifaceted issue. It's really a balance between retention and attrition. And whatever you see more of is kind of what's going to happen, right? If you have work-life balance, if you have a job that's flexible, if the culture at your organization is good, and if you think what you're doing is engineering, then you're probably going to end up staying in the profession. But if you don't have that work-life balance, if your job isn't flexible, if you're starting to see cultural disconnects, and if you're not sure, you don't have the confidence that what you're doing is engineering, then you're likely not to stay in the profession or pursue licensure. So things like confidence building opportunities, intern cohort program, returnship program, those are things that can build that confidence and can also make sure that we have graduates that hopefully on a higher basis continue on to professional licensure, and then offer a pathway for those that have left the profession, a way to return to the profession kind of going forward. So I'll just finish off by acknowledging Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba for their support of this research. It was a lot of data gathering that they had to do on their end to support all of this. So I really appreciated that. As well as Dr. Marcia Friesen, who's now the Dean of the Price Faculty of Engineering. She was my thesis advisor, and she gave lots of great insight as I was working through this project. So a lot of that is owed to her as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions or have a little discussion here. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, so happy to entertain any questions.
If I may, thanks very much, Kathryn. Just a friendly reminder for those that may have joined late, if you'd like to ask Kathryn a question, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask it orally. Please note that this is being recorded. If you don't want to do that, you may chat your question privately to me, Irene Vasilevsky. In the start, I have like a whole list of questions, so I'm just going to start. Was this done at like anything similar done in any other provinces?
Not yet, not an academic study. There's been lots of advocacy-based studies where they've looked at some interviews of women, but not to sort of this extent. Although I think that this is something that's happening now, because I think there's a lot of value that comes from actually doing these interviews and having, especially the focus groups. We got a lot of information from the focus groups when we brought the women together and they started talking about their various stories. It kind of triggered different aspects that they hadn't thought of in the one-on-one interviews, because they're like, oh yeah, I had an experience like that too, or oh yeah, I was worried about that. So I think that was really good. So I think there are some associations that are starting to look at doing this type of research as well in their jurisdictions.
Right. I noted that Ed has his hand up. Ed?
Thanks for first of all doing this presentation for us and the research and the effort that went into it. I think this is all really valuable. Certainly when you started, I just felt this horror when I seen the initial numbers, but you know, I feel a lot better knowing that there's efforts. And just as you went through the presentation, just some of the ideas that I had, I was happy to see that have already been thought of and programs are already starting to try and, you know, create support for people that are you know, want to return to the profession. Or I think the intern cohort idea is a brilliant one as well. Just one thing, you know, I realize that you call it a black hole, and yeah, when students graduate, it's really, really difficult to try and keep track of them and then hunt them down later to try and, get this kind of data from them. I have a foggy memory, and I don't think it was a U of M, but other, other schools had this idea of giving students a permanent email address that would live on even after they graduated. And I don't know if the reason behind doing that was exactly for these reasons, so that you would always have a way of tracking down your graduates, but that might be something that we should look into.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't actually know what happens to the new SAE Manitoba email addresses once students have left, right? I mean, I still have I had to get mine changed because mine still shows up as UM Fergus, which is my maiden name. So that little beginning part is still the same, and they've changed it to make it look like my new name, but the background is still there. So I would think that you would have that same email address, but students probably don't know that. And I don't know. That's a good point. We should look into that. Because that's the problem, is if they don't check their U Manitoba email after they graduate, and they don't, they're all avoiding the phone calls from alumni asking for donations and supporting students, 6 months after they graduate. So they're not going to answer the call and give their forwarding email address. But yeah, that's a good point. I can look into that and find out what the advancement services is doing in terms of connecting and using those SAE Manitoba email addresses in perpetuity. And
for the returning members, the program that it sounds like is underway with EGM. I remember when I was in industry back in the 90s, and this was before the IEQ program, but it seems, and this was back when EGM wasn't even APEGM yet, it was still APEM. But they had some kind of program that they were using to try and get foreign trained engineers into the workforce. And I ended up, for lack of a better word, adopting two of them in my department. And they were both like middle-aged guys from Eastern Europe. And the one guy seemed to really struggle with the language and didn't end up doing so well. But the other guy, he was amazing, and we ended up hiring him full-time. I think it was like a 6-month pilot program, something like that, just to get them up to speed on how we do engineering in Canada. And out of the two guys that I had, like I say, the one guy just worked out wonderfully. So I thought that program to me was very, very successful. And if we did something similar, with members trying to return to the profession, I think that would be a successful program too.
Okay, well, and so was that done with the association, or was that just done with the industry? It was with the association.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was done.
There's got to be records somewhere. I'll mention that to Lisa Stepnick. She's the Director of Equity and Outreach. And so maybe she could do some digging and see if there's records of kind of how they structured that.
Did you say that was at Motor Coach Ed?
Yeah, that was when I was at MCI, and it would have been, the mid 90s. And,
yep.
The IEQ program, when did Marcia create that? It would have been much later than that.
Yeah, it's probably about 15 or 16 years ago now, but still.
Yeah.
And the IEQ program does have a co-op element to it. So it wouldn't be unlike, it could be something similar to that. I think the biggest hurdle is making sure that industry doesn't treat it like it's just a co-op term. Like we're going to have these returning experienced professionals doing what a third-year engineering student would be doing, right? It's not the same thing as co-op. Right. It's at that higher level, and I think that's going to take the commitment of industry to make sure that the program is structured in a way that it's actually beneficial to participants, but also to industry as well. So,
right. Yeah, and I mean this is taxing my memory from 25 years ago now, but it seems to me that these guys that I again adopted, for lack of a better word, were heavily subsidized. Like we weren't paying a full salary for those positions. So that subsidized, I don't know where it came from. It might have been through the government. Actually, Ron Britton might be a good guy to hunt down and ask about this, because he might have had something to do with all of that. Because I think the IEQ program started through him as well. But that was a huge carrot for us out in industry to get extra help at, you know, a discounted rate.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. I will, we'll do some digging and see if we can find out about that program and how it's sort of structured.
Okay, it's 7, but I have a comment and some people have to leave. Thank you for joining. I understand some people have to leave. It is 7. Engineers and geoscientists are big team building events or the bro culture thing. It's golfing and curling. Like I know Lisa's trying to add in some more stuff, but we're our own worst enemy sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes we are, right? And you know, it's funny too, when we go to some of these different industry events too, like the Aerospace Awards Gala or the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, they're very male oriented in the way that they're sort of structured. Even the food choices for dinner, it's like meatloaf and like steak and stuff like that. You're like, this is, you know, it's little things like that that just people don't recognize as being, and it isn't even just, you know, sort of a female male thing. It's even just a cultural thing. Like Winnipeg is becoming very, very multicultural, but a lot of the engineering events are very white, hetero.
Yes, white, hetero, male orientated.
Yeah.
I know my first conference I went to for automotive engineering was, I would say, 95% white, male, gray hair. And there was one black man and 2 other women besides me out of like 3.
Gray suits.
They're all wearing gray suits, and it was about 300 participants. So it was horrifying for me as a young woman to be overwhelmed that way. But
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox because it is 7. Thank you so much, Kathryn. Thanks everyone for participating, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.